Episode 5, Part 2, Harvard, Accountability and Institutional Protection, the Summers Case. Before we begin, a quick note. This episode discusses publicly reported information about Harvard University, Jeffrey Epstein, Larry Summers, and a network of faculty, donors, and institutions connected to the Epstein files. All information is based on publicly available reporting, institutional reviews, and released government documents. This episode is for analysis and commentary and is not legal advice. Files open, glass poured. Let's talk academia. Before we get into this, make sure to like, subscribe, turn on notifications, and leave a comment, because this is one of those episodes where the conversation moves beyond a single person and into something much broader and much more uncomfortable about how universities actually function. We are staying with the Boulevardier tonight. If Part 1 introduced it, Part 2 lets it sit a little longer, and what you begin to notice is not the balance, but the bitterness that lingers. Which is fitting, because this is the part of the conversation where the aftertaste becomes the point. Take a sip. Last episode focused on Larry Summers, his background, his authority, and ultimately the decisions that led to a very public unraveling. Tonight, we widen the lens, not slightly, but entirely. Because Summers is not the anomaly. He is the predictable outcome of a system that academia has spent decades building and almost no time interrogating. And that system begins with Harvard University. Founded in 1636, Harvard is the oldest university in the United States and one of the most powerful academic institutions in the world, with a reach that extends far beyond education into finance, policy, law, science, and political leadership. This is not simply a university, it is a network of influence, and like any network of influence, it runs on resources. Now here is where the public understanding of academia begins to diverge from reality. Even at Harvard, arguably the richest university in the world, faculty are not simply funded by the institution to pursue their work independently. They are expected to secure external funding. Labs require sustained financial support. Graduate students need stipends. Research projects require infrastructure. And increasingly, faculty are evaluated, promoted, and sustained based on their ability to bring in money. And at this point, we need to pause and ask a very basic question, one that people outside academia are already asking. If students are paying tens of thousands of dollars in tuition every year, where is that money going? Because from the outside, this looks contradictory. Harvard has an enormous endowment. Students are paying significant tuition. Faculty are generating prestige and research output. And yet, faculty still have to go out and fundraise. That disconnect is not accidental. It is structural. Universities do not eliminate the need for external funding. They institutionalize it. They incentivize it. They reward it. Which means faculty are not just scholars. They are fundraisers. And once that becomes the model, everything that follows starts to make a lot more sense. Because Jeffrey Epstein did not enter academia because of intellectual contribution. He entered because he understood leverage. He positioned himself as a patron of science, hosted private dinners, funded conferences, offered introductions, and, most importantly, offered or suggested the possibility of funding. And in academia, the possibility of funding is often enough. Between 1998 and 2008, Epstein donated at least $9.1 million to Harvard, including a major $6.5 million gift that established the Program for Evolutionary Dynamics under Martin Nowak. But the real value of those donations was not the dollar amount. It was access. Epstein was given office space. He had keycard access. He visited Harvard repeatedly, even after his conviction. He met with faculty regularly. And over time, he was treated less like a donor and more like a participant. That is where the shift happens, because once access is normalized, boundaries begin to erode. Nowak is one of the clearest examples, but he is far from alone. At Harvard, Lisa Randall maintained extended correspondence with Epstein and traveled on his plane. At Harvard, George Church was connected through funding channels facilitated by Epstein. At Harvard, Stephen Kosslyn was associated with programs supported through Epstein-linked funding. At Harvard, Alan Dershowitz became publicly tied to the broader controversy. And at the center of all of this sits Summers. But to really understand how normalized this system is, you have to look even closer. Because this dynamic does not stop with him. It extends directly into his household through his wife, Elisa New. Now, Elisa New is not a peripheral figure in this story. She is a senior Harvard faculty member, a professor of American literature, trained at Columbia, with a well-established scholarly career focused on poetry, public humanities, and literary culture. She is also the creator of Poetry in America, a major public-facing initiative designed to bring poetry into classrooms and media spaces. In other words, she represents exactly the kind of faculty member universities highlight when they talk about impact and intellectual leadership. And that is precisely why what happens next is so revealing. Because when you look at the timeline of her interactions with Epstein, you see the same pattern, only now it is closer, more personal, and much harder to dismiss. In 2013, New reached out to Epstein to help secure an interview for her course. He facilitated it. In 2014, she followed up about potential funding tied to her project, discussing how donations could be structured through Harvard channels. By 2015, she was thanking Epstein for support that had significantly advanced her work. And in 2016, Epstein made a direct donation to her nonprofit supporting that project. All of this occurred after his conviction was widely known. At the same time, Summers himself continued communicating with Epstein even as new reporting brought renewed attention to his history. So what you see here is not a single questionable decision. You see a system operating across levels. A faculty member building a program and seeking funding. Another faculty member maintaining donor relationships. Both operating within a structure that normalizes this behavior. And that is where the critique becomes unavoidable. Because this is not an outlier. This is what the system produces. Now widen the lens again. At Yale University, Nicholas Christakis engaged Epstein around research. At Yale, David Gelernter maintained correspondence. At Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Joichi Ito resigned over Epstein-linked donations. At MIT, Seth Lloyd accepted funding tied to Epstein. At Bard, Leon Botstein actively pursued Epstein for funding. At UCLA, Mark Tramo maintained ties. At Duke, Dan Ariely engaged Epstein. At Rutgers, Robert Trivers received funding. And when you line these names up, the conclusion becomes difficult to avoid. This is not isolated, it is structural. And this is where public trust begins to erode. Because from the outside, this looks simple. It looks like academia can be bought, not through explicit corruption, but through access, through funding, through proximity. And once that perception takes hold, it is very difficult to undo. Because now the question is not just about Epstein, it is about the system itself. Now return, one final time, to Summers. Because Summers is what happens when someone at the very top of this system fails to recognize or chooses to ignore the risks embedded within it. He understood donor networks. He understood institutional power. He understood reputation and still maintained that relationship, which is why his fall carries so much weight. Because if someone at that level can make that decision, then this is not just about individual judgment. It is about structure, and that is where faculty frustration becomes very real, because the consequences are not evenly distributed. Junior faculty make one mistake, and their careers can end, lose funding, and their research disappears. But at the top, the system slows down, becomes cautious, protective, and everyone notices. Which is why this story resonates far beyond Harvard. Because it confirms something people have long suspected but rarely see so clearly. that academia, for all of its claims to independence, is deeply entangled with money, and that entanglement creates vulnerabilities. So I want to hear from you. Leave a comment. If this can happen at Harvard, what do you think is happening elsewhere? Should universities refuse money from questionable donors? And how should faculty navigate a system where funding is both necessary and potentially compromising? If you find these conversations useful, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because these are not isolated cases, they are patterns. And in the next episode, Episode 6, Professional Judgment Under Pressure, the Allison Friedman case. A single moment, a microphone, and a reminder that sometimes it is not the system that exposes you. Sometimes it is you. Final note. This episode is based on publicly available reporting and institutional records and is intended for analysis and commentary. Files closed. Glass empty. See you next time.